Hi, I'm ED-SKaR and this is Colonel Colm Corbec, Tanith first and only's 2IC, beloved by the soldiers he commands. Well, except for a few ne'er-do-wells. In the video today I'll be painting this model from the 2021 Gaunt's Ghost set. As with some of the other models, I'm painting Corbec off of the base, and we have a great big lump of tree here so it'll glue down nicely when we're done. I also used the same mix of powders and rocks on the base and gave it a grey prime. As there are 6 models to talk about, I don't want to repeat myself and make 6 near identical videos, so I'll concentrate on one feature or area of the model for each video. This is the second Corbec model I have, so I could compare it to the 2002 Corbec and talk about consistency over the army, but I'll be speaking about that subject in the next video with Rawn. So in this video instead, I'll speak about the greens of the cloak, as I should have started with this in the first video. So there are 3 paints involved, a dark and a light green, the same paints that I've been using for my entire Ghost army, but for this set there is a tiny bit of blue for the shadows. But first, a single thin coat goes down. Usually everyone goes on about 2 thin coats, but with the next layers that I'll be using, I'll have plenty of opacity, and this first coat is just so that if any part is missed, it'll at least be slightly green. And I'm also taking care of the other base coats on the underside of the model so that I can get it back on its base and held in my painting handle. For painting in the sub-assemblies, I am essentially just painting the model off of the base. It's far easier than some of my other options, but I still wish I had some way to hold on to the model with something hand-sized, like a painting handle. With those out of the way, we go back to the cloak and mixing the 2 greens for the second layer. This is far easier than layering between 3 or 5 different green paints, and the reason for that is the base pigments each paints are made from, which if you use many different pots of paint, you have many different types of pigments, and that can leave visible layer lines between your layers and the gradients of your colour difficult to achieve. But I'm not actually spending a lot of time over the gradients in the cloaks, because most of this will be covered up by the camo pattern later on, and, secret tip, if you get a bad bit on the cloak, put some spots of camo on that exact spot to hide it. But why blue in the shadows? There are many ways to highlight in shadow, and it's not something I've fully explored. In fact, I haven't looked at it very much at all. The most common ways that mini painters highlight in shadow is with brightness or saturation. In fact, one very easy way to paint is to use black and white. These both change brightness and saturation. Black darkens, white brightens, and both desaturate. And you can even use grey to desaturate without changing the brightness much or at all. To achieve a saturated highlight, you would probably want a different paint with saturated pigments. So you can paint with only saturation or only brightness if you choose exactly the right pots of paint. But there is another way. You can paint around the colour wheel. If we look at a 6-point colour wheel with primary and secondary colours, green is obviously between blue and yellow. So as blue is generally the darker and yellow is generally the lighter, we could paint into these colours, which would give us a great interesting mix of colours that might gradient well into each other but maintain the flow of brightness from dark to light. Many orc players will be quite familiar with highlighting green into yellow. I wonder if we could do it the other way round. Could we highlight green with a light blue and shadow green with a dark browny yellow? Something I certainly want to play with, but that's for another video. Well, using the concept of both painting into desaturation and painting around the colour wheel, I have chosen a little of both. The blue I'm mixing into my darker green is only very slightly darker than my dark green, and my light green is quite desaturated as a paint. And once I've got a passable mix of highlights and shadows on the cloak, I'll go in and fill in most of the rest of the models, the rifle, the belts, the uniform, and so on. You might notice that the shadows in certain parts of the model are stronger than others, such as the uniform, or the highlights are stronger elsewhere, like the skin will be later on. And that the cloak doesn't have particularly strong highlights or shadows, Some of this is intentional, much of it is accidental, and most of it is just because I've done my army this way and I'm kind of practiced with the recipe. For the character squad, I have pushed a little further in every direction, saturation, hue, brightness, but it's only a little further in any given place. I got to wondering whilst painting Corbec here, if I start from scratch, if I paint a single model to the best of my display style I could, with any of the paints or maybe even buying specific paints for it, and not following the recipe that I've come up with for my army, how would that model look? What differences would there be between my currently painted ghosts and that model ghost? With most of the model painted now, I'm heading back to the cloak for the camo pattern. I've switched between a few styles over the course of the 40 or so cloaks I've painted so far, starting with a simple stripe pattern that I quickly found to not look quite right, then going for a few styles of spots, stipples and speckles. I'm currently painting with a mostly spotty motion, creating small patches of spots in a given colour and putting several of these patches around the cloak. Once I've gone around with a few different colours, the cloak fills up to the point where there's no area in between the patches. This mostly complete coverage of spots is my current favourite, but there's no guarantee I'll stick to it. I do find inconsistency to be a deliberate effort, and in the camo pattern, it must be inconsistent. That's what camo's for. So painting all of the patches the same size isn't quite right, and painting all of the spots the same size also has the same deliberate feel that camo probably shouldn't have. And so I have to be conscious of both of these and deliberately break the pattern that I'm subconsciously trying to create. Varying the size of spots, making some larger, oval or even curly shapes, and then the patches making some small, some large, and varying their position. Rolling the model onto completion with the skin. Unfortunately, I moved my painting handle around and the autofocus got confused, so much of this is unusable footage. But reaching underneath his fringe, which is a separate piece on the sprue, was somewhat difficult. I would probably recommend that you glue the fringe on, but keep the head separate for painting. Unfortunately, I glued it down and I wasn't going to risk smashing that fringe by breaking it back off. Corbec also has some spiral tattoos down his arm, which are a difficult thing to paint, and I may have to do a separate video on Tanith tattoos at some point. And here is Corbec complete, and I can compare him to himself from 2002 with the pewter model. Both grizzled and bearded and awesome. I can't help but like them both in different ways. Old Corbec is a simpler model and closer to true scale. While he's not realistically proportioned, it's closer than any of the Cadian or Catachan models, so the old set looks very good in comparison to those. New Corbec has a lot more details. Separate fringe piece, a fancy lasgun with gnarlwood, but double fancy as it has a heat shield over the barrel. He has bigger and billowier cloak and a piece of tree to stand on. The proportions are a little more heroic, but still very reasonable and not as bad as the Cadian or Catachans. Displaced in the army by the new, bigger Corbec, the old model will still be fielded, but as a simple lastman. Please check out my playlist of other Gaunt's Ghost videos. I've been showing as many methods for making the cloaks as well as other modelling techniques, parts and supplies for making a Tanith army. Also all of the other YouTubey things, there's a comment section for asking questions, a description with links to my other stuff, but with all that said, I'm ED-SKaR, always will be, and thank you very much for watching.